Good afternoon, good evening for everyone who is joining this webinar. It's a great pleasure of welcoming you here. My name is SRHM. I'm the Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, and I'm joining you from France, the countryside of France, next to Geneva, Switzerland. And warm welcome to all the co-partners who are organizing this webinar and who are here in crime for the special issue of special collection of SRHM on sexual pleasure, and also welcoming all the panelists and participants of the webinar whom Paramita will introduce in more detail. We are here today of celebrating Sexual Health Day that was officially announced yesterday, and it's a Sexual Health Month. And also because of the launch of the Sexual Pleasure collection of the SRHM Journal in collaboration with our partners, the Pleasure Project and the Agents of Ishq. And I'm warmly welcoming the guest editors of this special collection, Anne Pilfot, who is the founder and director of the Pleasure Project in this beautiful gold purple outfit, and also Paramita Vora, who is a filmmaker, writer, founder, and creative director of Agents of Ishq. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for this beautiful collaboration and also for organizing this webinar together with your colleagues. Just a little bit of context before handing over the funky and exciting coordination of this webinar to Anne and Paramita. I just would like to give a little bit of context about how we came to this pleasure collection. Those who know SRHM, that was founded in 1993 by visionary founders of Marge Berer, Sundari Ravindram, and other academic scientists, activists from the field of feminism, women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, came together in 1993 to found this organization, RHM at that time, that is organized around the scientific rights and evidence-based journal. Throughout the past 30 years, SRHM has been publishing about sexuality and sexual health, and the content of sexuality and sexual health evolved as the field evolved and knowledge evolved, and how activism, advocacy, knowledge creation expanded around sexuality and sexual health. It was in 1995 when RHM published an issue about promoting safer sex, 98 about sexuality, 2004 about sexuality rights and social justice, 2009, the first ever journal issue and collective publication about criminalization of sexuality, HIV, and reproduction, 2010 about cosmetic surgery, body image and sexuality, 2013 about young people, sex and relationship, 2015 about sexuality, sexual rights and sexual politics. In 2018, we changed our name to Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights as a political statement, how SRHM intends to uphold the comprehensive understanding of sexual and reproductive health that includes sexuality and sexual health. And it's around the time, I think, when we started to talk about the launch of a special issue and putting together a special issue with Anne and in collaboration with the Pleasure Project. And here we are today of launching a special collection that is the first of this kind of SRHM about sexual pleasure. And when we started to talk with Anne about a special issue, we also thought that we should look at what has been already published there. And Anne and colleagues and the Pleasure Project have done a much, much broader understanding and research of how pleasure is included in sexual health and sexuality related knowledge. And then we invited Anne and Paramita if they could come in and assess the SRHM content about sexuality, sexual health, and how it is pleasure inclusive, recognize what has been already out there, and at the same time invited to bring together an editorial that is critical, honestly critical about the content that has been out so far from so many perspectives, but also look forward at what is the knowledge content that we would like to see. And Anne and Paramita will talk about that, how the editorial is acknowledging what is out there, has some critical analysis of it about the pleasure content, and looking forward, including a call for papers from here on that can be published and co-produced by our partners. I need to acknowledge this fantastic collaboration that I think for the Pleasure Project and for Agents of Ishq was not necessarily so easy, because it taught us of pushing our boundaries of SRHM, where we can be possibly more open, more inclusive, more creative, but also recognized where we need to kind of safeguard collaborations with our regional and country-based partners who are more focusing on distributing the knowledge that we are producing. So we are extremely pleased and thankful for this collaboration. We also want to acknowledge with the cover that is provided by that is Samuel Bester's art piece, and we are extremely happy that we are here today, and I'm handing over to Anne and Paramita to orchestrate and conduct this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Esther. And indeed, it's very exciting to be here with all these brilliant minds, but also with all of you who have signed up. We've had a phenomenal sign up for this webinar, which is great. But we've also set ourselves a bit of a high bar, Paramita and I, to make this one of the most pleasurable webinars that you've ever attended. And I know that you've attended many over the past few years. So we hope that you heard music when you joined. And we're now going to show a brilliant film that Agents of Ishq created. And what would be great is in the chat, this film might give you some reflections about what gives you pleasure. You may learn something, you may think something new about what gives you pleasure. That thing may be having a great cup of coffee, but it may be something else. So please watch this film and then add in the chat if you'd like to any reflections or what gives you pleasure. Thank you.
Why one thing, yaar? Most unfair.
I love starting out on top and holding his hands down, interlaced in mine.
What I like most is the build up to sex.
I like it when sex is slow and then gradually builds momentum.
Kabhi dirty, फिर slow, पर contrasting.
चुम्मियाँ,
Kissing.
पप्पी करना,
वो जोश भरे चुम्मे वो आहें,
playful sex,
role play,
Doggy style.
The more spanking and hair pulling involved, the better.
कि दूसरे पर इतना विश्वास हो कि आप जो मन चाहे वो आप कर लो.
Shahrukh Khan type kiss on your neck. I like that.
You know, just at the curve.
मेरे पेट पे kiss.
I enjoy my feet being kissed.
कोई मेरे कान चाटे तो मैं बस पिघल ही जाती हूँ.
My breast stimulated and sucked.
Good old penetration.
मुझे ना अलग अलग पोजीशंस पसंद आती हैं.
I like missionary. I am cool.
I like my pussy being eaten.
जब मेरा पार्टनर मेरे निपल्स को चूसता है ना, उसी टाइम पे नीचे भी मालिश करते हुए, तो समझ लो ऑर्गेज़म की बरसात होने वाली है.
I love Orgasms.
Orgasm.
Orgasms.
Orgasms.
Brilliant. So please just put your reflection, say where you're from, but say also what gives you pleasure. So without further ado, I actually wanted to, I know you're all likely had quite busy days, you're all in different parts of the world and different time zones. So I just wanted us all to take a moment. And if you feel comfortable, I want you to take your thumbs and fingers or different elements of your fingers and then just breathe and close your eyes if you like and rub your fingers together. So just feel what that feels like. Like, what do you enjoy about the rubbing together of them? What do you maybe enjoy about rubbing your hands together? What feels nice? What doesn't? What do you like about that? Close your eyes and think about that. And why I've done that is really to kind of bring us back into our bodies and this moment, because even though the brain is the biggest sexual organ, in my view, in sexual health, we tend to locate our thinking almost exclusively in certain parts of our brain. And we try and make pleasure logical or an intervention. We try and box it in, try and give it indicators. But really, this webinar and this series is about supporting each other to unlearn that, to really see the potential of pleasure, to truly liberate. This is what this panel are here today to do. And this is what this series is about, to understand that asking ourselves what feels good, what is the most pleasurable sexual experience I ever had, is radical in itself in these sex negative times. And that's why I was delighted to be asked to write this editorial, because this pleasure series is the first open source series focused on pleasure in a health journal. And secondly, because this journal was the first one to accept an article that I wrote about 25 years ago about introducing a new safer sex technology into the world, which was the internal or female condoms, which is what they were known then as. And it was at the time the only alternative to the external or male condom. And that article and my experience of talking to so many people around the world about how to use condoms in their sex lives was the beginning for me of founding the Pleasure Project, because I was so outraged that pleasure was so dismissed in sexual and reproductive health and rights, and that we tried as a community to motivate people to use condoms through fear of death, danger and disease. When it was obvious to me, and from what I could learn from those who navigated that condom use so regularly, that they are plainly potential sex toys. And so I wanted to elevate the skills I saw, and in my case, working with sex workers, to eroticize condom use, to reach the global health industry. So I naively started talking about pleasure to shocked audiences at international AIDS conferences, where frankly, people act like STIs or AIDS are airborne diseases. And so it's obvious to a few of us practitioners that pleasure inclusive SRHR means more sexual health. And we finally now have the research with the World Health Organization to prove that pleasure is not only the icing on the cake, but it's also the icing on the cake. And if we stopped the shame or silence around pleasure at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, there would have been many, many more lives that we would have been able to save. But looking back at that time, I had a limited view of what pleasure meant in sexual health. And as I dove into pleasure passionately and with gusto, I sort of relearned that we can't box pleasure in, that it offers a portal to a range of liberations, that the ability to feel pleasure is universal and arguably the key reason people have sex, but in equal terms is silenced and stigmatized and demonized. And there's a hierarchy of which pleasures are allowed. And those of us who have marginalized gender or sexual identities, or women of color, queer people, sex workers, poor people, people with disabilities are further down the hierarchy in the way that they are allowed to express or explore their pleasures. And so that's what we focused on in our editorial. And reading, as Esther said, reading the past pleasure content in this journal showed us some great articles. It showed us how indeed pleasure helps us deliver sexual and reproductive health more effectively, but it also helps us redefine the boundaries of what sexual health is. And also, really importantly, how pleasure can reframe how the development sector defines impact, how we can move beyond not just stopping diseases, but we can move towards visioning of well-being and improving well-being. But we can also start having fun conversations like this one, where we explore our desires and the political power of them. So we also read articles that showed us that, to engage with what makes us feel good means opening doors to the diversity of our erotic natures, like touching our fingers at the beginning of this webinar means to us and others, but how real skin hunger can be when your sexuality is diminished or denied. But also, we really want to emphasize that we're all experts in our own desires, and when we allow ourselves to ask what makes us feel good outside of these external restrictions, we can really start to explore together this new knowledge. And then ultimately, pleasure allows us to reset the frame of sexual and reproductive health set by colonial or biomedical and patriarchal history, and claim a sexuality beyond these boundaries. And we at the Pleasure Project have designed the pleasure principles to help you take those steps, and we'd love to hear more in the content that you submit about how you're doing that. So that just gives you a little snapshot of the editorial and what Paromita and I found. But I now want to encourage you to enjoy our editorial and the series and the articles we've chosen, and we really look forward to more of those, and we'll talk more about the content that we want. But I want to introduce my wonderful co-editor and co-conspirator, Paromita Vora. So I have to say, about 10 years ago, I thought the Pleasure Project's doing some quite cool, radical stuff, and pushing the envelope. And then I saw Agents of Ishq, and I was like, whoa. And I basically fell in lust and love at first sight with their content, which I obsessively started following. I loved it all. I love how they give sex a good name, or how they use film or poetry or song to open up the conversation. And I'm delighted Paromita agreed to do this with me, because I've learned a huge amount from her. And I think the health world, and we all have a lot to learn from her multiple wisdoms. You've already seen a film, but we're going to hear a poem later. And Agents of Ishq use poetry, song, and beautiful images to show people what's possible with sex education. And the Pleasure Project and Agents of Ishq even wrote pleasure manifestos at the same time in parallel. So, enjoy those from our editorial. Of course, SRHM and health journals such as this need to include evidence that is robust, and our systematic review and meta-analysis with the World Health Organization showed that pleasure-inclusive sexual health leads to significantly more sexual health and more condom use, and that made a huge difference. But, let's be frank, explaining a meta-analysis to most people on the planet would either make them run for the hills or kind of glaze over. So instead, what we need to do is read our safer sex fantasies together, as we did many times with the Pleasure Project Open Source Fantasy Bank, and Agents of Ishq have done similar things, putting many of these out as their content. That makes people engage, that makes people listen, and that makes people feel more excited to have the sex that they like, that is their choice and is safe for them. So thank you. I'll stop now, and Paromita's going to introduce the other panelists who I'm also thrilled are here today. Thank you. Over to you, Paromita.
Thank you, Anne. And of course, thank you, SRHM, for making this happen. I mean, I wanted to start also by, first of all, saying thank you to everybody who's come. Thank you to Anne for inviting me along on this journey. And I was remembering this morning, around 9 years ago when we started Agents of Ishq, and I walked into our very tiny office on a very hot day, and everybody jumped up and said, we've got some really exciting news. The Pleasure Project has put us on its pleasure map. And I was like, what does that mean? I don't know what you're talking about. But I think that it's also not common to find projects like the Pleasure Project. And to find, in that sense, an expansiveness, generosity, looking for solidarity and partnership, and really trying to join all these different kinds of work around the world together to show how it can all constitute a kind of heterogeneous but connected politics, right? And I think when we were writing the editorial and we were looking through the articles, we really looked for things that made our interest quicken, right? Like when you would read an account that was very experiential, that came from a place that is normally not acknowledged at the center, it immediately told you that there is a new political possibility inside this. And we wanted to bring those kinds of views together so that when people are reading the collection and when they are thinking about these themes in their work, they are imagining actually the political frame of pleasure as endlessly inclusive, as constantly transformative, and as fundamentally liberatory. I think one of the reasons why there is so much fear of pleasure, and Shireen has a wonderful phrase in her essay, an endless lexicon of reproof. You find it everywhere, right? And it is, of course, through social and cultural institutions, but it was also the burden of colonialism that so many cultures carry. And that's also evident in disciplinary approaches. The way that we think, where we think knowledge comes from, what knowledge we think is important, what should that knowledge look like? What does it mean to look knowledgeable or be knowledgeable? So I think that when we are looking at varied quests for pleasure, or as we say in our editorial, like stories of sexual success, not only sexual tragedy, we are actually looking at people who are denied a space in the center of the discourse. The discourse is heteronormative and it's very solemn, and it likes to keep everything controlled, scalable, countable, measurable. And pleasure actually ups the ante because everybody's definition of pleasure is different. It is formed by their culture, their biography, and some kind of unpredictable thing called fantasy and desire. And so actually it asks us to create a frame that is politically fluid and can help many things coexist, right? So when Anne said that your idea of pleasure may be to drink a cup of coffee, or it may be BDSM, or it may be poetry, or it may be polyamory, there actually should be the possibility of having all of these things in one place, because that's the most human part of us. And eventually to be human is what human rights is all about, what it should make possible. Without more delay, I would like to introduce our panelists who will be able to speak to so many of these questions. We're really delighted to have Dr. Zara Stardust. They are a social legal scholar working at the intersection of sexuality, technology, law, and social justice. And as you can see, a really nifty dresser. They are the author of Queer and Feminist Reflections on Sex Tech in the SRHM Journal. That's their essay. Also with us is Dr. Shireen Al-Feki, a British-Canadian Egyptian academic and author, and best known for her book, Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. She is the author of the essay, The Arab Bed Spring, great title, Sexual Rights in Troubled Times Across the Middle East and North Africa, also in the SRHM Journal, so you can check all these out later. And finally, Lawrence Shapiro, who is a validated deaf and disability artist with the Canada Council for the Arts, and has for nearly 20 years been a leading amputee dancer in Canada and British Columbia. And he is the author of the essay, The Disabled Sexual Surrogate, published in the SRHM Journal. And I should say here that it was an essay that really inspired Anne and I when we were writing the editorial. And I would encourage everybody to go read it, just for the way it lays out the immense possibilities of eroticism, compassion, and connection, along with politics. And I'm now going to invite Anne to ask a question to our panelists to start the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Paramita. So we've got two questions for the panelists, but we really wanted to start off by really getting your views on what you think what knowledge or what has moved knowledge forward on pleasure. So we've talked about some of in the editorial, some of the knowledge and the evidence that, or the lived experiences that had, really touched us, that, as Paramita said, really, felt a quickening when we read them. And, and that's why you're here. And we want to know what you think has moved forward or moved knowledge forward on pleasure. And I don't have a particular order, so I don't know who wants to jump in first. Shall I go for Zara first? You're smiling, so I've chosen you.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for having us all here today. I love a discussion about pleasure. I'm tuning in today from Yugan Bay country, the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples, which means pretty-faced wallaby. I'm in southeast Queensland of so-called Australia. And I'm here on lands that were stolen 230 years ago that have never been ceded. They belong to the oldest continuing culture on this planet. And so they were and always will be Aboriginal lands. And I think it's important to start conversations on pleasure by thinking about place and by thinking about positionality, because our pleasure can't be separated from all of these things. And as you write in the editorial to this issue, pleasure means different things to different people. This issue contends with pleasure politics, which is something that's inextricably tied to place and to identity, relationships, to power, to all of these different markers that shape our experiences. And I think holistic pleasure becomes much more possible when people have access to health and rights and justice, and when land is returned, when accountability happens. These are things that make pleasure more possible. So in the meantime, people are finding pleasure in the margins and in the moments, but to facilitate more equitable relationships to pleasure, lots of structural things need to happen. And for me, that's because pleasure is not just something that happens in the body. Pleasure is cultural, pleasure is collective, and it's not apolitical. The desires and attractions that we have towards particular bodies or people are very much culturally constructed, at times by hierarchies of white supremacy or ableism or transphobia. So pleasure politics is also about deconstructing what people think of as natural preferences and unpacking how that's shaped by media and by culture. And it's about interrogating not just what pleasure is, but whose pleasures matter. And today I wanted to share some thoughts from my research over the last few years on pleasure and pornography and sex tech. And in terms of what has moved pleasure forward in this space, I think in part it's been the decentering of hegemonic and heteronormative forms of pleasure, especially away from clitoral orgasm as the supposed pinnacle sexual experience. And throughout history, often white feminist approaches have focused on pleasure as located only in the genitals or in orgasm-centric pleasures. And of course, we have an orgasm gap. That's a serious issue and a real issue, but also there's so many more pleasures to be had. And in the sex tech marketplace, the understandings of pleasure are often about efficiency or quantification or optimization, like how fast and how hard can you orgasm. But in our research, we found that people had very different relationships to pleasure. We found that pleasure is that's depicted in the marketing narratives often targets heterosexual couples or cisgender women. It's very pink and fluffy. It can be quite dysphoric for people who are outside cis hetero bodies and sexualities. And while a lot of the marketing for sex toys is about how people receive pleasure, for example, through dildos or through vibrators, for our participants, they were interested in giving pleasure and providing pleasure. And so they were interested in how the toys and the harnesses and the equipment would feel on their bodies, what they felt like to wear. But then they worried about how that equipment would fit a fat body, or whether it would irritate sensitive skin, or what kind of labor they required from a body with chronic pain. And people that we spoke to wanted to buy sex tech from places where they felt culturally safe, or where sex tech was described not in terms of binary bodies like his or like hers, but in terms of how the bodies functioned and what bodies were capable of. So this like decentralizing of pleasure as something that's not prescriptive or linear, but something that can be found in all these unexpected places, I think that has really expanded the vocabularies and the scripts of pleasure. And it's something that I've also found in my research into queer and feminist pornographies. So when I've interviewed producers, they were really passionate about moving away from orgasm-centric scenes. Many of them paid performers for their time with no expectation of orgasm, because they didn't want to reduce the scene to a set of predetermined positions or routines or bodily outfits. And so they were like, why would this particular intimacy be valued more than this other kind of intimacy? And how do we unpack these regimes and these hierarchies? And we also see queer crip porn performers like Laurie Erickson, or sexologists like Shanna Katz, who have written about disability and intimacy coordination, about how to create accessible sets, and asking performers about their needs and their accommodations, and offering information about how sets look and feel. And we have, of course, racialized performers wanting more self-determination over their image, their descriptors, their representations, what Murray Miller-Young writes about as erotic sovereignty. So those are just some of my reflections from over the past few years at the level of the body, that centering of cis hetero ideas of pleasure can encourage multiple pleasures to proliferate, and that indie porn producers are practicing a pleasure politics that rethinks scripts and production norms. And that's something I write a little bit more about in my upcoming book, Indie Porn, Revolution, Regulation and Resistance, which will be out in October. Thanks.
Thank you, Zara. That's brilliant. My brain is exploding with all these new thoughts, but I think it's wonderful to have all your expertise around, you know, moving us beyond the kind of obvious quote that, you know, porn has become sex education, but what we can also learn from the porn world, what we can learn from sex workers, what we can, and I love this phrase, erotic sovereignty. I often think about erotic justice, and that's what we've just written something, Arushi and I at the Pleasure Project, about what is erotic justice, and you know, these erotic manifestos that the Pleasure Project and Agents of Ishq have written. I very chime in with that, but what you add is so huge to that. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Shireen now, and you had an intro from Parameter, but just to also say that Shireen is the new or fairly new director of Solidarity for Voice and Change at the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is fantastic news. And very lucky for IPPF, given all of your wisdoms and experience. And so just handing over to you in terms of what you think has moved forward knowledge on pleasure.
Great. Well, many thanks, Anne and Paramita and Esther. It's a great pleasure, as it were, to join this webinar. And just straight off the bat, that video, Paramita, absolutely excellent. Right after this session finishes, I'm going out to water the roses, and then it's a soft serve ice cream for me, definitely. So as you heard from Paramita, most of my experience has been in the Middle East and North Africa. Like so many of you on this call, I've been called a sexpert for the Arab world, which I have to say, sadly, was not a career option that my high school guidance counselor ever offered me. And so what I'm about to talk now is really from that perspective of mainly the Middle East and North Africa and the wider Muslim majority world. I find the question really interesting and the phrasing of it, because of course there's knowledge, but then there's understanding. And they are intimately entwined, but there are distinctions. So my comments are going to reflect on both, basically. And it's going to be very basic for me, speaking as a former academic. The importance to move the knowledge forward is to be able to ask the questions and to do the research. And in the collection, I particularly enjoyed the many papers that are bringing qualitative and quantitative methods, but really very interesting ways of getting into the heart of the matter. Now, speaking from the Arab region, that's a very, very different proposition. And those of you who are joining this webinar from across the Middle East and North Africa will know at firsthand what I'm talking about. Essentially, the only way that we can start to ask the questions is, as the editorial mentions, to problematize sex. And you talked about it as a disorder, as a dysfunction, as a disease, as a disaster. Right? The ability to really get into the other elements and the upside of sex, as it were, is very, very difficult, because the real framing here is putting the white coat of public health on, which gives you a sort of respectability in order to even tackle some of these tough topics. Now, what I find really interesting, and the way I look to the future, is by actually looking to the past. So in particular, in the context of the Middle East and North Africa, we are very buttoned up about sex today, but we were not always that way. For most of our history, we were considered to be the masters of sex. I mean, there is, we produced self-help treatises, we produced medical guides, we produced poetry. I'm telling you, there is nothing in, I don't know, The Joy of Sex, Cosmopolitan, TikTok, Girls, Euphoria, that they weren't writing about in Baghdad 1,000 years ago. Now, what's very interesting about that long and really rich history of sexuality and sexual writing is that it really did focus on pleasure. Now, I have to point out that Michel Foucault dismissed all of this as ars erotica, but it is actually scientia sexualis. It is the science of the day, and it is fantastic. So much so, I'm just going to quote from one of the books, all right? We have a book which came out in about the 10th or 11th century in Baghdad. It's called Jawami al-Ladha, the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. I'm telling you, it is covering everything from anal sex to zoophilia. And what's really interesting is that it is talking about pleasure as not just male pleasure, but also female pleasure in particular, and how important it is. So if you can bear with me, I'm just going to read a very, very short extract from it. And it's talking about the types of female pleasure. And it's talking about a woman called Hubba al-Madaniyya, who was said to live in Medina in the pre-Islamic period. And it says, Hubba al-Madaniyya, for instance, said that one day she went out of the bath accompanied by a boy who had a puppy. It so happened that the puppy, seeing her vulva and vaginal lips, went between her legs and began to lick her organ. She lowered her body to give the animal a better chance of performing its job. However, when she had reached an orgasm, she fell down heavily upon it and could not raise herself until the helpless animal had died from heavy blood pressure. So apologies to the animal lovers on the call, but the reality is that it talks extensively about female pleasure and its importance. And there's a lot about male anxieties about how to satisfy their female partners. And of course, it's not just heteronormative. There are chapters and chapters about other non-heteronormative sexual encounters. And what I think is so interesting about all this writing, and it also speaks to the situation we have today, is that so many of these great books about pleasure and sexual pleasure were written by religious scholars. And they saw nothing incompatible between fulfilling the needs of the flesh and the needs of the faith. And I think all this is important because if we flash forward to today, the idea of sexual pleasure is seen as some sort of fruit from forbidden fruit from the tree of the sexual revolution that is going to be an invasive species in our culture and is going to completely outcompete our tradition and our culture and our religion and our so-called, our values, quote unquote. And so I think when we look to the past and the ability to ask these questions and to celebrate pleasure, it gives us a sort of guide forward, because again, it's picking up on what so many of you have talked about, that pleasure is a real threat to the patriarchy. And that's its power, right? And when you take that and when you understand that generating this knowledge is not just about what's happening in the bedroom, it's what's happening in the boardroom and in the Senate House. I think that connection will provide the incentive, hopefully, to look at pleasure and to take pleasure seriously. And so I'm delighted to be part of this, and I'm really looking forward to the future papers that will come to the collection.
Thank you, Shireen. Brilliant as ever. And as always, I love the way that you remind us we're living in very sex negative times and it was not always thus, but also remind us with such great examples and evidence that this kind of sometimes disturbing belief in the international development sector that pleasure-based sexual health or discussions of pleasure is only possible in what's called, in certain contexts, or it won't be possible in a so-called challenging context, or, and you can sort of list the countries that people will say, either, Denmark, Netherlands, Europe, whatever. Actually, what we see is that, there's so much more expertise and history, as you say, in the Middle East, but also so many trailblazers and innovators, many of whom might be on this call, who are doing brilliant work in parts of the world that, you know, I've had funders say to me, oh, that's not going to be possible, right? And I think it's really important to keep reminding ourselves that we're in a particular moment, that, you know, in fact, you know, I read something a few days ago, a sex education manual from even Victorian Britain that talked about the importance of female orgasms. I mean, granted, it was thinking it was for fertility, but still orgasms were mentioned, right? So, you know, thank you so much. I think, you know, and your article also got me at the title. You had me at the title, the Arab Bed Springs, that was it. And it will be great to see more people, maybe some people on this call are thinking about submitting an article, are thinking about how they can like elevate the experiences they've had, the conversations that they've had, the pleasure, the narratives of pleasure that have been silenced in their contexts and cultures. And your book is a great one to read if they want to have some inspiration. Thank you. Now I'm going to go over to Lawrence, who we're delighted is also on the panel. We love his work. We love the fact that he combines both his brilliant wisdoms, but his lived experience, the way that, Lawrence, you communicate your experience that, you know, is very personal, but is also very universal. I think the fact that you bridge the worlds of dance and academia is also really exciting, and is another thing that we found really exciting from some of the content. But I think also you're talking about the work of sexual surrogates. Your work is something that's rarely shone a light on, and you know, we'll be delighted to hear your views on, you know, we know that you've pushed pleasure knowledge forward, but what do you think has pushed knowledge on pleasure forward from what you've seen?
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Yep. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to this. This is an extraordinary gathering, and it really means a lot for me to be here. Before I answer the question, I'd just like to make a very brief comment about what happened at the beginning of this webinar, is that we were asked to rub our hands together, and we were also asked to touch our fingers. And that instruction, it represents huge assumptions about ableism. It assumes that everyone has two hands. It assumes that everyone can rub their hands together. And I think it's important to recognize how these assumptions about physicality sort of permeate themselves into all this types of discourse. I'm not saying it's an ableist attitude, but I'm saying it's a very typical attitude coming from the able-bodied dominant world. To ask someone to rub their hands together comes across as such a simple gesture and such a simple request. No one would ever question it. But coming from a disability standpoint, I was asked at the beginning of this webinar to engage in a physical gesture, which pre-assumes physical ability, and it also pre-assumes body image. It assumes that I have two arms and two hands. So that is a huge assumption that's being made. So I'm being asked to give my perspective from a disability perspective. And at the beginning of the webinar, I'm asked to engage in a physical gesture, which pre-assumes I'm an able-bodied person. So that's something that we need to think about, and it's something that we need to address further on. So I would ask you in future webinars, do not ask people to rub their hands together. Not because it's a bad thing to do, not because it's insulting, simply because it's a pre-assumption. It's a pre-assumption about physicality, and it's a pre-assumption about body image. So that's my little comment about that. How is knowledge moved forward in pleasure? I would say from a disability perspective, pleasure is fundamentally a political victory. The opportunity for a disabled person to have sex represents something that was historically oppressed. And the opportunity for a disabled person to have sex, whether it's with same sex or transgender, whoever it is, it doesn't even matter. The physical act of sex becomes a political victory for the thousands and thousands of disabled people in history who never had that opportunity. The problem that we face in the disability community is how you access sexual opportunity. So in my opinion, sexual opportunity needs to be done through sexual surrogacy. Last year, I had the most extraordinary experience where I did a dance residency in New Zealand. And 20 years ago, New Zealand, I believe, had something called the Prostitution Act of 2003, where sex workers have been liberalized. So I'm looking to New Zealand for advice here. I think it's a great path forward, and I think it's something that we need to focus on. We also need to think about people with intellectual disabilities and how they can appropriately express their sexual desires and opportunities that can be made available to them. But I'm not nearly as eloquent as the other guest speakers. So all I would want to say is, in a disability context, I believe sex becomes a political victory, and it becomes an awareness of the human body, that the disabled body is sexually attractive, it's sexually valued, and but you're not going to have it unless you have financial resources in terms of sexual surrogacy, which is why I published a policy paper 20 years ago in Disability Studies Quarterly, asking the Ontario government to include funding for that for disabled people in the province. But the knowledge of pleasure, in my opinion, has increased in a disability context, because pleasure is no longer just pleasure, it's political satisfaction. And the political satisfaction melds into the physical gratification, if you will. I personally don't believe sex is about physical gratification. I think that's a social construct. I think at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the night, if you excuse the pun, is what people are looking for is intimacy, and the success of intimacy. And I'm glad that the Pleasure Project does not place a focus on penetration. Speaking, I think I'm the only man here. I'm the only cis man here. So I can tell you that from a man's standpoint, there's such a focus on performance, and it works itself into a sexual hierarchy. So intimacy becomes the political victory in the disability context. And I would say that is how knowledge has grown in terms of pleasure, in terms of my community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you for pointing out the ableism in my exercise at the beginning. I apologize for that to everybody on the call, and I've taken note. Thank you. And thank you for your amazing talking about performance and you know how we get taken away from sex as intimacies, or intimacy for us, but how there's a pressure and how gender norms can be damaging for all of us in many ways, but that how pleasure can open up a discussion to challenge those gender norms and really understanding and kind of sitting with what feels good for us is also something that is rarely asked without this lens of gender norms. What pleasure looks like for us in our body is something that can feel very uncomfortable if you're thinking about sex as a performance. So thank you very much for that. Real brilliant insights as ever. But I'll hand over to Paromita to carry on with the second question.
Thanks, everybody. I mean, actually, I don't really feel like asking a second question, almost because I feel such a vast landscape of ideas was already covered in the first round. But I think what we really understood was the way in which talking about pleasure allows different identities and experiences and different histories to enter and rewrite the meaning of politics at some level when we think through a lens of pleasure. I was also wondering how a certain, like a regime of forms which are pleasurable or not pleasurable, and the way that pleasure isn't really part of the way we communicate knowledge, or what are the forms and disciplines we use to understand the world. How could we think about changing this? For example, I was in Agents of Ishq, when we started, we too had the imagination that we would create all this cool stuff. It would be pleasurable, but we would create it and we would put it out for people to watch. But what began to happen is that people began to write to us and share their accounts, their experiences, their sexually intimate narratives. And that actually completely changed the shape of the platform. And it co-created, in a sense, the platform. So it ceased to be a place where we were sharing knowledge in a pleasing fashion. And it became an endlessly reshaped framework that the audience and the creators of the platform were jointly authoring. So I'm wondering, actually, through your particular work, how you imagine the lens of pleasure reorganizing the way that we all do our work, whether it's academic work, whether it's development work, whether it's artistic work, and so on. And what are the different forms of knowledge, for example, technology or art, in your case, Lawrence, or looking at histories in a certain way, but talking about it academically differently, Shireen, how these can really enter also the space like the journal? Like, what are the absences in form that the pleasure lens could address? So maybe I'll ask Shireen to go first.
And maybe, Pramod, if I may, I'll talk less about form and more about substance. And what you talked about is the inclusion and the voices that may or may not be heard. So I noticed in the collection, there's a podcast, which is, I think it's called Shining a Light on Sexual Pleasure. And it features a number of experts, including IPPF's own Mahmoud Garga, who's talking about Treasure Your Pleasure project that was done with IPPF, and perhaps, and you can say a little bit more about that because that was a huge success. So very much, looking at youth and pleasure. And of course, we tend to think of sexual pleasure in particular as a young person's dream and an old person's memory. But I think what's important is to look at the other edge of the spectrum. So sexual pleasure in later life. And I think that doesn't get enough exposure, enough research, but I think it's really important to consider. I'd say another area that I think would lend itself to further exploration is really the nexus of pleasure and religion and faith, because there tends to be the default attitude born of hard-won experience, I have to say, that religion is antithetical to sexual pleasure. But at least in the Islamic context, I can tell you that it is. And I know Islamic conservatives will tell you that on all these matters to do with sexuality, it's black or white, but definitely there are at least 50 shades of gray. And that is actually informed by the political landscape as well. So I think that nexus would be interesting to explore. And finally, I think the other lacuna which I would love to see filled is really the intersection of language and pleasure, and how different languages, the research into this, and how different languages elucidate and the concepts of pleasure, and how language reflects pleasure and vice versa. I can tell you in Arabic, for example, back in the golden age, we used to have whole dictionaries of sex. And one of them in particular has, I think, 1,083 verbs for to have sex. And now in the Arab region, and my colleagues from Middle East, North Africa, maybe living this firsthand, that if you want to talk about sex and in particular pleasure, you're using French or English or any other language except Arabic. So I think that would be interesting. And related to that, in terms of finally to end on the form piece, that the journal SRHM has done a wonderful job on translating into different languages and making the knowledge accessible. And I think I would make the call for this pleasure collection to be translated so that all of us on the call can read it in our own languages.
Thank you. That's so very comprehensive, systematic. But I think what it also speaks to is something you alluded to earlier, this idea of the qualitative, right, as being a space of knowledge. So that an arts-based approach to looking at people's experiences, to recovering histories, but also to recovering language, because the pleasure of speaking in language is very contextual. And the tendency is to talk about sex in a clinical language, which is shorn of all texture, so that it seems to be respectful, inclusive, etc., but really is kind of empty. And also to recover some of the pleasures of slang and to start finding a new language to talk about sexuality altogether, which mirrors really the way that we experience pleasure and experience connection and intimacy also, which language is so uniquely tied to. But I was thinking too that some of the reasons why people love to have a sort of neutral language is because it is scalable, right? And like when you raise the question of language and translation, all these questions come into play. How would we translate? And that's also the reason why people love to talk about technology, that technology is so scalable and it can reach a lot of people and becomes very instrumental way of talking about technology. And I was wondering, Zara, if you would speak to that a little bit and to the forms in which we can talk about technology and think about technology actually, and what are the absences in that discourse, which maybe also can be addressed by the journal and by other people who are listening in their work.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. There's so much to say about technology. I wanted to add first, in terms of knowledge, I think we need to look at embodied knowledge, absolutely, and people who are from marginalized communities, who are sex workers, who are body workers, who are doing the work and speaking from our bodies. For me, I hope that this pleasure collection is going to spark a bigger conversation about structural barriers to pleasure. And just to pick up upon what Lawrence was saying earlier, and looking to different, like access to sex workers, for example, for people with disabilities. And the New Zealand model has been great for many ways, but also it still criminalizes temporary visa holders from doing sex work. And so there's lots of other models for sex work, full decriminalization we can look for in Australia, for example, in the Northern Territory. But even then, we still have these big, it's a massive debate at the moment in Australia because our government is trying to stop people with disability from using the National Disability Insurance Scheme to access sex workers as personal service providers. So it's still, yeah, access to supports is absolutely necessary, but still incredibly politicized. And so, yeah, for me, I'm thinking a lot about what are these structural barriers to pleasure. And also I'm thinking about, like I often think to a scholar, a Yulian Gamilero scholar here, Larissa Berendt, who wrote that like the fight for sexual politics can't be separated from the fight to end settler colonialism and sexual racism. And she's spoken a lot about, you know, sexual liberation for white women has meant looking for the right to say yes and seek different sexual partners without condemnation, but Aboriginal women still fighting for the right to say no and destroy the myth of the promiscuous and oversexed Black woman. So I think like thinking about a pleasure politics for me is also grappling with these bigger issues and structural determinants of pleasure and of violence, and particularly at this time in the world now, a settler colonialism, militarism, imperialism, genocide. These are big things that need to be addressed before pleasure can even be realized for so many people. And on an individual level, then people are trying to figure out how do we find pleasure in the wake of abuse, or how do I find pleasure amid trauma, or how do I make space for pleasure in the context of constant pain. And some research that my colleagues and I have been doing around menstrual tracking apps, we found that most people were using those apps not for their fertility, but because they wanted to track their pain as a pain management strategy. So earlier I talked a bit about the decentralization of pleasures, but I wanted to mention briefly about decentering pleasure itself, which sounds strange in a collection like this, but because the equitable distribution of pleasure relies on so many different things. And in terms of technology, we ran a sex tech hackathon a couple of years ago, which we wrote about for the journal. And we brought together designers, educators, community and asked them, what do you envisage as public interest sex tech or social justice sex tech? And there have been a number of sex tech hackathons around the world that have explicitly focused on pleasure. In NAM in Melbourne, for example, people designed more accessible dental dams or virtual reality consent education. They designed sex toys for people who are undergoing menopause. But at our hackathon, we were taking a slightly different approach to pleasure and thinking about what are some of the structural conditions that shape pleasure technologies and pleasure industries, like the climate crisis or surveillance capitalism. And so one of our groups of participants, they were really concerned with the amount of disposable single-use plastics that are prevalent in sex tech, whether it be pregnancy tests or condom wrappers. And so they were looking to how do we find end-of-life cycle solutions for sex tech? How do we investigate organic materials like algae or mycelial networks to break down silicon? We had another group who were really worried about the policing and surveillance of marginalized communities through digital technologies, especially dating apps. And so they were looking at how can we create technology that allow people to share only discrete parts of their sexual identity so that they can avoid police entrapment. We had further participants who were looking at how they could put sex tech businesses in conversation with marginalized communities to do like an impact assessment of their cultural relevance and their accessibility. We had participants who were looking at virtual accessible pleasure-focused sites for people with disability that meant to combat the pervasiveness of the medical model of disability. So in each of these projects, people were really thinking about pleasure as something that's influenced by a broader range of regimes, infrastructures, hierarchies, systems. And yeah, for me, I'm thinking a lot about how all of these structural issues need to be dealt with before we can even have more equitable pleasures. So my hope is that this collection, while we continue to explore the possibilities for bodily pleasures, we also prioritize thinking about the structural determinants of pleasure.
Thank you very much. But I think when we talk about decentering pleasure, maybe another way of also talking about it is there is an analogy between the way we talk about technology and the way the danger we are in when we talk about pleasure, which is to talk about these things in a very instrumentalized way, that they are things that are going to provide solutions. And the solutions are all agreed upon already, right? Because the problems have also been agreed upon already, but actually that both pleasure, technology, experience, the arts, and so on, actually spin us out of that linearity and say that many things are happening simultaneously. And our needs and desires are multiple, contradictory, and we can't actually assume anything before we begin. So that pleasure actually, the question that Lawrence raised before when we were preparing for the seminar, what do we actually mean when we say pleasure is not something we can assume either, that the meanings of pleasure are many, and just as the applications and even the meanings of technology are many for people, depending on where they are. So the idea that there is pleasure in political autonomy is something that also needs to actually be acknowledged. But some of the questions that you raised, and actually Shireen has kind of alluded to in a sense, I feel are also connected to an idea that almost never enters a conversation on pleasure, sexuality, or knowledge, and that is emotion, right? And I was thinking about what you said, Lawrence, about people looking for intimacy or connection, and this politics of emotion that we're actually talking about, and whether you see that as an absence, and whether there's a place or a way in which the arts especially, but also expression of any kind, can bring this into the journal and spaces like the journal.
For me, sorry.
For you,
yes, well, I would really like to talk about, just very briefly, disability arts and the role that disability arts plays in pleasure and political empowerment. So I'm a validated deaf and disability artist with the Canada Council. I just did a show in New Zealand last year, and hoping to do another show this year. So performance as a disabled person speaks to physicality, it speaks to vulnerability, it speaks to physical exposure, which in turn, I believe, speaks to a kind of eroticism, if you will. This is my body, this is what it can do. You're all looking at my body, and I'm taking pride in my body. And this is the satisfaction I take from it. And just when I started dancing, I can still remember in dance, there's something called contact improvisation, where one dancer will touch the other dancer and so on and so on. And I can remember an early dance class where a woman lied on top of me and she rolled across me. And I was not aroused by that in any way. The only point I would want to make is that by doing so, she sort of shattered preconceptions about touch and about boundaries and so on. Because her rolling over me, the idea of a woman rolling over me in a non-erotic way was still very empowering for me. So that's one example, I think, of how the artistic spectrum, particularly in disability arts, contributes to a sexual self-esteem, if you will, and an erotic awareness, which I think is so critical to the whole pursuit of pleasure.
Thank you for that, Florence. I mean, I think like our panelists have spoken about many different kinds of ways in which there can be new kinds of work in the journal. And I think that we will also be soon inviting the audience to say what they wish was in the journal. But Pete, who is from the journal, would be able to tell you how you can actually send submissions to the journal. And I'd like to invite him to do that right now. So Pete Chapman from SRHM.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Pete. I'm managing editor of the SRHM Journal. And today I'm going to be talking about pleasure-focused submissions to the SRHM Journal specifically, which we're very keen to receive. Although, as mentioned, this collection highlights both journal and non-journal SRHM content. I'm just going to share my screen with you, so bear with me a second while I do that. Hopefully that's shared my screen. Let me know if it hasn't. Okay, so for non-journal content, such as blogs and ideas for podcasts, etc., you can get in touch with our communications team who'll be happy to discuss this with you. An email address for this is info@srhm.org, and this will be provided at the end of these slides and also after the webinar. Journal content refers primarily to traditional peer-reviewed materials such as research articles, review articles, study protocols, commentaries, and perspectives. But it's important to emphasize that if you have an idea for an article that doesn't necessarily fit within these traditional categories, then please do get in touch with us and we can discuss how we might be able to assist in a submission to the journal, as we're really keen to explore potential new formats. An email address for journal queries is editorial@srhm.org. And again, this will also be shared at the end. As we're sort of seeking submissions in response to this sexual pleasure collection, and so that we know that your manuscript is being submitted in response to the collection, please do mention in a cover letter with your submission that it's being submitted following this call for papers, so that the editorial team is fully aware of it. So the first port of call for manuscripts when writing or preparing to submit to SRHM is our instructions for authors, and these can be accessed via the instructions for authors tab at srhm.org. And hopefully these will provide all the details you'll need, but if you have any questions during the preparation or submission processes, then please do get in touch with the editorial team and we'll be happy to help. Also, it's worth mentioning here that to assist new and less experienced authors, SRHM is committed to providing mentoring by one of our editors, subject to capacity. And if this may be applicable to you, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at the editorial email address and we can discuss how we might be able to work together. So we should mention, I think it's been mentioned in the chat already, that SRHM is an open access journal and therefore is freely accessible following publication. All of its articles are freely available online. It's also, because of this, it's associated with article publishing charges for manuscripts that are accepted following peer review. So no charges are required at submission, but should a paper be accepted following peer review, an article publishing charge may be applicable. Again, full details of these can be accessed via srhm.org. So some information on this, the standard APC article publishing charge for accepted SRHM articles is $2,195 or £1,756, but it does vary according to article type. So depending on what particular format your manuscript may take, there may be a different APC that's applicable. And you can check how much the APC would be for your manuscript at the address on this slide, which again will be shared after the webinar. So APC waivers are available from our publishing partner, Taylor & Francis, and this is based on geographic location. Information on this can be found at the address on this slide. And in addition to that, SRHM has a limited number of editorial waivers that we can offer for those who don't have institutional or organizational funding, for example, and who aren't eligible for TNF's geographic waivers. And if this is applicable to you, then you can send a request with some background information and ideally a manuscript outline of up to 500 words to the editorial email address. And we can take a look at that and discuss with you how we can hopefully help progress with your submission. So once you've written your manuscript and checked the potential APC, you're ready to submit to the journal. And to do this, you'll need to head to Taylor and Francis's submission portal, which is at the address on this site. Again, this will be provided after the webinar. So in terms of submission, everything can be done via this site, including correspondence with the journal team, although you can always contact us directly via the editorial inbox and we'll always be happy to respond. In fact, that's quite often a quicker way of doing it because it comes directly to the SRHM team and we can respond very quickly. Once manuscripts have been peer-reviewed, revised and subject to acceptance, they'll be published online and as mentioned, they'll be freely accessible to anyone. Should also mention that the authors retain the copyright for published articles. So that's pretty much it from me in terms of the actual submission process and sort of how to get in touch with us if you have any queries. As I say, the information is on the SRHM website or can be accessed via the SRHM website. But if you have any queries, then please, as I say, don't hesitate to get in touch. So a quick reminder of those SRHM email addresses. For journal content rather, it's editorial@srhm.org, and for non-journal content, it would be info@srhm.org. So yeah, thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you and receiving your pleasure-focused submissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete. There are already some suggestions coming in the chat on things that people would like to see. Notes from the field, how people are incorporating pleasure in their community interventions, neurodivergence and intimacy. There's a question, would there be a charge for non-journal content, like for blogs and other things?
Great question. Yeah, there's no charge for non-journal content. So that will go on the SRHM organizational website. And that will be, there's no charge at all for that. So again, if you have any queries on something that might be related to non-journal content, then our communications team will be happy to chat with you and get back to you very quickly.
We are also trying to...
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Pete.
Just I saw one question. APC is the article publishing charge. So it's the charge that is associated with an article once it's been accepted. So no charge at the point of submission, but in terms of, because it's an open access journal, once an article has been accepted, for it to be published, there is an article publishing charge associated with it. And that's how the open access system works with regard to gold open access.
And we just like to point out that we are, as a journal, we are very aware that there are incredible inequalities around how open access opened up, and then it created a burden on those who are writing and trying to publish and subjected to author publishing charge. As a journal, we are working with other journals and with the publishing community to challenge inequalities around it. We have some APC waivers available with SRHM. That's why Pete said that please let us know if you have a difficulty to pay for the author publishing charge that is set by the publisher. And we are trying to actively fundraise with partners to have some funding available for more author publishing charge waivers. And we will update you about their availability.
I think there's like also lots of interesting links that people are sharing to their own work and their own publications in the chat. And I think there's a proliferation of platforms and formats which may not have peer-reviewed knowledge, but it's peer created and co-created knowledge. And so I think people would find it useful. And we look forward to the day when there can be some kind of meeting point of what is considered rigorous and what is created with passion. And maybe passion's a different form of rigor, like political passion, that makes people create knowledge and bring knowledge together. So I hope that all of these things will come together in some glorious fashion that is out there. I think we are coming to the end of our time. Am I right? Yes. So first of all, I mean, amazing, and will thank you more eloquently that I'm able to do for all your fantastic ideas. But because it's a seminar, webinar in which we wanted things to be pleasurable, fun, and diverse, we are going to end with a poem. The poem is appropriately titled Happy Ending. It's a poem written by one of Agents of Ishq's readers. It was submitted by them. They are called Pragya. And I think one of the most amazing things about this poem is that it actually has two versions of happy endings, and therefore speaks to the idea that pleasure has no one meaning and nor do happy endings. So happy ending version 1. In the time you took to respond to my text, I got a driver's license, drove all the way to Nepal from Bangalore, and started a family with a man named Diljit. Diljit speaks my love language. Emotional intimacy doesn't spook him. Diljit speaks my love language. Public opinion doesn't spook him. Diljit speaks my love language. Even paperwork and government officials don't spook him. Instead, he guards my heart, enjoys my art. He gets me flowers, makes me whiskey sours. I spank his bum, and he makes me come again, again, and again. Happy ending, version 2. In the time you took to respond to my text, I uninstalled all dating apps and ordered a vibrator online. I started by erasing all the trivia about Chelsea FC, drones, and death metal from the depths of my brain, then went on to unlearn the taste of your favorite food, the way you smelled, and parted your hair. Unlike you, my vibrator is available, dependable, and secure. Can you imagine? Unlike you, it doesn't interrupt my sentences. It doesn't pretend to be feminist to get laid. It never tries to explain Reddit to me very slowly. Unlike you, it makes me come again, again, and again. So that was Happy Ending by Pragya. You can read the poem on the Agents of Ishq website. I'll put the link in if you're dying to send it to your best friend because it resonates so much. So yes, and thank you to Pragya who wrote that poem. And I'll hand over to Anne to thank everybody.
Thank you, Promita and Pragya. What a brilliant poem. And we thought a poem would be very appropriate as a happy ending because we also linked to the poetry collection in the journal and elements of that poetry collection that resonated for us for the editorial on pleasure. And we'd love to see more poetry, more podcasts, more variety of forms, as it was called. I'll be super brief because it's so hard to summarize all the brilliant thoughts and words and everything that you've put in the chat. But we really, it was great to hear about different views on access to pleasure, where and whom, and what that means within a world where it's constrained by structural factors, this decentralizing of pleasure from the discussion about what enables pleasure, the potential of new technology, but also that beautiful link between, that Lawrence said, between vulnerability and eroticism as well. That was something that was coming up for Paromita and I in some of the articles that we read, but also great to talk about the importance of diverse forms of knowledge, of what we hope to see, and we're just really looking forward to hearing from you. So send us your love letters, as we call them. Tell us what makes you feel good and why that's important. Expand our fantasy bank as a community. We've heard such amazing reflections from these amazing panelists. And connect with us as a pleasure family. We need to hold close to be able to expand this knowledge. And I honestly believe we're the most fun people to connect and work with. So, and also have some pleasure today and ask yourself, what gives you pleasure. So thank you so much, Zara, Shireen and Lawrence for pushing the boundaries of pleasure and showing us the way. And thank you to all of those at the Pleasure Project and the Agents of Ishq who have made this happen, and for SRHM for pushing their own boundaries and being bold in doing this. So, and thank you for everybody. We've got a huge number of you online, so that's fantastic that you've joined. And I'm just before we finish off, I believe that Esther just wants to say a couple of things and then we're closing.
There is not much to say, but thank you, Anne and Paramita, and the colleagues of the Pleasure Project and Agent of Ishq, but also for SRHM colleagues to working very hard to push our own boundaries in relation to this pleasure collection. Thanks to Pete, Jessica, Emma, and all. And thanks for the panelists and those who are here today. And let's continue the Sexual Health and Pleasure Month in September and celebrate and recognize and mourn and all together whatever we can do in our personal and professional spaces. Thank you so much and have a good night, good morning, good day, good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.